What is the difference in a mutual termination versus a unilateral termination of a real estate agreement? Because in many cases, even agents mistake the different types of terminations or notices, and it causes problems in the transaction, and we'll get into that. We received a question from Sherry in Canton saying she's under contract and they decided to terminate before the due diligence period was over. She wants to know what's the difference between a unilateral and a mutual termination. Who keeps the earnest money? So let's set this up before we get into answer Sherry's question. And the standard real estate purchase and sale agreement in the state of Georgia is a document or a set of documents, hundreds of different documents that can be used, where agents just fill in the blanks on the documents, but the forms are written by, expert real estate attorneys who work for the Georgia Association of Realtors. I don't know if they're paid, but they work for them. It lays out the way the terms of a purchase and sale agreement work. And one of the contingencies, you're able to have multiple contingencies. A buyer's purchase would be contingent on the seller giving them good title. It might be contingent on getting their financing approved. It might be contingent on getting an appraisal that comes in at or above the purchase price. And then one of the last things that it can be contingent on, and it can be contingent upon anything that you as a buyer want it to be contingent on. But one of the most common contingencies is what's called a due diligence period. And so the contract will say buyer has 10 days from the purchase agreement date or from the binding agreement date to inspect the home, do all the different inspections that they want to do, and to either, number one, seek to amend the contract to have the seller address things that they find are wrong with the home, or to terminate the contract. And the termination can be for any reason or for no reason at all, which means a buyer who goes under contract with a due diligence period has the sole option of buying the home, because the seller can't sell it to anybody else when they're in contract with you, but not the unconditional obligation. After the due diligence period, the seller would have an unconditional obligation because their ability to terminate the contract would end on the last day of the due diligence period. So a couple things to remember. If you have a due diligence or an inspection period in a contract, it is the buyer's responsibility to either send an amendment to address concerns. So here, seller, the things I need you to do, agree to remove the due diligence period, or to remove the due diligence period and buy the home as is, or to terminate the contract. And so a lot of people are concerned about which form to use when it is time to terminate. The contract says specifically that the buyer has the unilateral right to terminate the contract prior to the end of the due diligence period for any reason or for no reason at all. And so the contract says that the buyer has a unilateral right, and that means one way, meaning the buyer can terminate and the seller does not have any say. They don't have to have a mutual agreement. Buyer says, I want to terminate. Seller says, okay, fine, we're fine to do that. It is a unilateral agreement. Buyer says, I'm not going to buy the home. Seller doesn't have any say. They can't keep them in the contract. They can't get any earnest money unless the buyer's defaulted in some way. And so in this case, Sherry, you want to terminate. You send a unilateral termination, and you'll know it. It'll say mutual termination agreement, or it'll say unilateral notice of termination. It asks you the reason why, but you don't really have to give it. But you say, I'm going to terminate the agreement. And at the bottom, it says the earnest money is to be returned to the buyer in this particular case. And in my opinion, in all cases where buyer is not in default in something else under the agreement, the buyer would be entitled to the earnest money back after sending a unilateral termination. So unilateral means one way. One party can do it without the agreement of the other party. Mutual means both parties agree, and a mutual agreement the brokers sign as well to determine what happens with any commission obligations that they have.